no, not pink. Make it blue.
And I would just like to remember some words of St. Francis of Assisi, which I think are really just particularly apt at the moment. Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair...
Margaret Thatcher, Britain's first woman Prime Minister. Strong, strident, confident. She seemed to relish a rather male image of herself. Fixed, rigid, unbending.
The ladies not for turning. Rejoice at that news and congratulate our forces and the Marines.
But there is another side to the Iron Lady. Another story to be told.
Dear Muriel, I decided to buy a really nice undie set to go under my turquoise chiffon blouse. I got a very nice... Can you recommend any exercises or anything from the medical point of view, particularly for reduction of the area of the seat and control of the tummy muscles? Oh, and also reductions and uplift of the bust.
A remarkable correspondence has come to light between Margaret Thatcher and her older sister Muriel. The letters date from Margaret's childhood and run until her early days in power. Intimate, unguarded, they reveal a complex early love life.
He drove me home in his present rather old car and got quite ardent on the way. I said I couldn't...
I think she regarded herself rightly as not having a fantastic body as such. We would have what I would describe as a sort of a modest amount of amorosity.
He's about 26 and very nice. Unfortunately, he returned...
She was very good looking, and she danced, my memory was, she danced very well.
The letters upset popular mythologies about Margaret. Her husband Dennis, for example.
I can't say I ever really enjoy going out for the evening with him. He has not got a very prepossessing personality.
And her relationship with her father, Alf.
Re-pop. He is eating the most enormous meals and doing absolutely nothing. I should, however, set a deadline to take him home as soon as he comes to you. Otherwise he will just hang on and not take any hints.
Margaret's letters allow a glimpse into the private life of this most public of women. They shed new light on the transformation of the very ordinary Margaret Hilda Roberts into the very extraordinary Margaret Hilda Thatcher.
Tony hired a car and we drove out to Abingdon to the country inn Crown and Thistle. I managed to borrow a glorious royal blue velvet cloak which matched the blue frock perfectly.
Tony had a spray of 8 orchids sent for me from London. So with the front part of my hair piled up on top, Jean and Mary said I looked simply smashing. I felt absolutely on top of the world as we walked through the lounge at the Crown and Thistle, and everyone looked up and stared. When Mrs. Thatcher asked me to write the book, obviously one of the most exciting things which only I would have is anything within the family, pretty much none of which had come to light before. And so it was natural for me, first of all, after speaking to Mrs. Thatcher and Dennis, to go to Mrs. Thatcher's sister, Murial. In the course of our conversation, it became clear that she had a lot of letters from Margaret. They're unsorted, I assume, therefore, not censored. And I think Margaret's pretty honest in these letters. For example, when she talks about everything to do with boyfriends and love, this is not exposing her innermost soul, but I think it's honest. I think it's telling Muriel accurately how she sees it, what she believes has happened, what the problems are, and how she's trying to deal with it. we went into the bar and had a gin and grapefruit, and then to the dining room for dinner. We had some lovely, thick,
creamy soup, followed by pigeon and then a chocolate sweet. With that, we had moussec to drink. Moussec, in case you don't know, is a sparkling champagne.
She had a strong relationship with her sister, a happy relationship. And I was always aware when my Aunt Muriel had been in touch with my mother. Generally, it was in times of political difficulty. That was when you could be sure that there would a phone call come through to say, "How are you? Everything okay?" Fine.
Muriel was 4 years older than Margaret, and her only sibling. A feisty, strong-willed woman, not unlike her famous sister in character, her life was far removed from that of Margaret. For 46 years she lived here on this farm in Essex, where she devoted herself to raising her 3 children with her husband Willie. When Muriel died, her collection of letters from her sister passed to her son, Margaret's nephew, Andrew.
We've got quite a lot of very nice things from the family. My mother, unlike Auntie Margaret, was a great hoarder. We have most of her letters from Margaret and from Grandpa to my mother. I would say they're very close as sisters, yes. Even though they were several years apart, you see, which one would have thought would have made a bigger difference, especially back in those days. But no, they were, although they were brought up as an austere family, they were a close-knit family. People often say to me, "Well, what's she like?" And I say, "Well, what's your auntie like?" She's just like your auntie. She was just an ordinary aunt. She always remembered our birthdays and Christmas, and she is normal. Nearly.
Dear Muriel, I got Daddy's present for me last Saturday. He asked me what I would like, so I said a powder bowl. He gave me £1 to go and get one, telling me to bring back the change. Got a nice one from Miss Griffin's for 10 shillings. It was very plain, just ordinary glass with a little gold paint round the top.
This is Grantham, where Margaret and Muriel were born and spent their childhood. It's a small town in Lincolnshire, built on the A1. A place travelled through as much as a destination in its own right. The cornerstone of the girls' lives was the family's grocer's shop, where they lived with parents Alf and Beatrice. The shop was a quality shop situated on a corner, positioned between the richer and poorer districts of Grantham, much like the family itself. Today, only a small plaque high on the wall records the significant birth that took place here in 1925. High enough, as one local put it, not to be peed on. But Margaret was the product of a time as well as a place. She was just 13 years old when the Second World War broke out. The Second World War was a vivid reality in Grantham. Being on the main railway line to Scotland and having a munitions factory, it was a regular target for German bombers. Inevitably, as for many of Margaret's generation, the war left an indelible mark on her.
I'm told that Mum was studying for her exams under the dining room table in Grantham, which was an area which was extraordinarily active during the war. And so the era of her teenage years and her formative years after that were just so completely different from ours.
For much of the war, Margaret's sister Muriel was away studying physiotherapy in Birmingham, leaving Margaret as effectively an only child. It was around this time that Margaret's letters to her sister began. They were surprisingly never about the terrors and disruption of war, but about everyday school life. They are full of personal triumphs, often highlighted by comments about lesser achieving classmates.
Dear Muriel, here are my school certificate results in detail which we got on Thursday morning. English language, C. English literature, C. General literature, C. There were rather a lot of failures this year, probably due to having Camden with us for 5 terms. General literature, C. History, C. Biology, C. French, C.
Margaret's letters expect Muriel to be interested in the minutiae of her achievements, and she's quick to criticise. One poor gym mistress, for example, is
an awful old irritable thing. She had a spotty complexion, lank, greasy hair, eaten, cropped, wore glasses and dowdy clothes.
Encouraged by her father, Margaret was a bright, hard-working, serious girl who'd won a scholarship to Kesteven and Grantham Girls' School, where she was to become a prefect and eventually head girl.
Sometimes she'd line us up for dinner, and sometimes she'd take us for prep, which would she'd sit at the teacher's desk and do her work, and we'd all sit there and do our homework. And we never, in fact, played her up. And even though we used to chatter a lot, but we actually didn't with her. And she did have this sort of aura that we just daren't do it, I think. She had this incredible air of self-possession. That's very rare, I think. She was quite a matronly figure. She had a bust, which I didn't have. I didn't clock in till many years after. She had her hair permed, and it was brown, by the way, light brown, not blonde. And she was perfect with her school uniform. And generally, I was in awe of her. I was really impressed by this girl, and I never forgot her.
Margaret took her prefect responsibilities seriously and reported somewhat witheringly the performances of her charges. There's a sense that the world might just stop turning if she wasn't at the helm.
Posters had to be made to draw people's attention to the fact that they simply must go to room 7. On Thursday evening, I had to sit down and do them myself. I also had to run around providing the material for the competitions. The youngsters are very enthusiastic, but not very ready to do a lot.
You learn many things, of course, about Margaret through the letters. You learn, of course, which is no surprise, that she's hard-working and competitive. She notices how other people are doing in the class, what her own results are, in exams, which she'll give at some length. She always monitors her own achievements. What she doesn't do, however, is introvert. She doesn't look in upon herself. It's absolutely unthinkable with her that she'd say, which so many teenagers or young people would say, where's my life going? What am I doing? Why am I on this earth at all? Nothing like that.
Of all the potential influences that shaped the young Margaret into such a serious young girl, it was perhaps her father who made the greatest impact. Alf Roberts was a self-taught, self-made man whose grocer's shop was a monument to the sort of personal enterprise, the self-improvement that Margaret championed throughout her career. A strong moral code hung over the Roberts household and coloured everything they did. It was rooted in the Methodism that was the spine of the family's life. Margaret's father, Alf, was a lay preacher, and on Sunday it was chapel 3 times a day. It was here that Margaret listened to her father's sermons.
Grandpa he wasn't a great deal of fun. I think probably I was a wild, dirty farm boy as far as he was concerned, and I think I said something pretty frivolous in front of him once, and I certainly got reprimanded fairly heavily for it.
Mr. Roberts would not have any Sunday newspapers in the house, believing that it was anti-Christ or anti-God to read frivolous stuff such as it was in those days on a Sunday, you see. Well, that's pretty archaic, isn't it? By present-day standards.
Alf's Methodism was all or nothing. He had no truck with other denominations, especially horror of horrors Catholicism, as he made clear in a letter to Muriel.
Dear Muriel, I have been very worried about Margaret this last few days, about her always having Mary with her wherever she goes, and wondering if Mary was doing a lot of Catholic propaganda with Margaret. I have written to Margaret about it. as I should be grieved beyond measure if the Roman Catholics got hold of her. She would no longer be free, and they might cause untold family misery.
Alf's agonies about the lure of Rome were unfounded. In fact, throughout her life, Margaret drifted between Methodism and Anglicanism, but in essence she was Methodist to the core.
Mother was a woman of considerable faith. It was an important component or adjunct in her feelings of self-reliance, duty, responsibility, but also her faith gave her a sense of Samaritan-esque attitude as well, in which, yes, there must necessarily be an element of charity, assistance, and help to others. But as she always used to say, even the Good Samaritan needed money to do it.
Alf Roberts devoted himself to the task of giving his daughters more than he had had himself. But in later life he told Muriel that he felt some of his sacrifices went unappreciated by Margaret. In a letter to Muriel, he said,
"Margaret has been very hard at times and apparently ungrateful for all I've done, although that hasn't and wouldn't stop me from doing all I could for either of you. But truthfully, it has kept me poor."
Alongside religion, the overriding preoccupation of the Roberts household was politics. Alf Roberts was a committed town councillor. When he wasn't in the pulpit, he was busy doing good for Grantham. He became mayor and was eventually awarded the title of alderman. For Margaret, politics was on the menu every day. At home above the Roberts shop, the affairs of the day were picked over, debated around the kitchen table. But Margaret's childhood was not all serious debate and religion. She was not all work and no play. Margaret's letters show that she was a young woman like any other with familiar passions, clothes, meetings with girlfriends, and a favourite pastime, trips to the local state cinema.
Dear Muriel, Quiet Weekend is here this week, and 2 other girls and I went to see it on Monday. It's an absolute scream. I laughed more than I have for months. I wish you'd seen it.
We're not going to let a ruddy policeman stop us.
Earlier in the week, Tuesday to be precise, I went to see Love on the Dole with Mummy. But I can't say that I enjoyed it, although it was a good film.
Margaret loved the cinema, and it was the American films that really caught her imagination.
We had a cinema called The State, and of course we had American films, and they really were our window on the world. And I think this must have impressed Margaret, certainly did me, those accents, and they were heroes on the screen.
In 1943, the heroes came to Grantham. The American Air Force established bases in the area. For the young ladies of Grantham, the Americans were manna from heaven. And for Margaret, it was the beginning of an enduring love for all things transatlantic.
She really liked all that, and she liked that culture, and she very much admired the American military, and she always felt at home with them. I think, therefore, the coming of Ronald Reagan as President of the United States was fitted very well with all of that, because she'd seen him in some films. She knew who he was because of that. He's of that generation, didn't fight in the war, actually, but she has an immediate sympathy with a man who looks like that, because appearance is always very important. There's this tall, genial, very American who's always very courtly to her. And this was just a whole set of things that made her feel at home.
The Americans became notorious in Grantham. They organised jives at the air bases, but Margaret's letters don't record whether she joined in. Most likely not. Her restrictive parents kept her on a tight lead. Indeed, there were almost certainly no boyfriends in Margaret's life during her Grantham years. But she was always well turned out and aware of the impact she made on others, men included. And when towards the end of the war she started going to more sedate local dances, she was often the target of eager suitors, such as a man she met at a Christmas dance in nearby Corby.
He was, I gather, a rather famous football referee, but he has done at any rate 1, if not more, cup finals. He is about 35, I should say. He wanted me to go to the pictures with him. I don't want to go around with a man of his age. And when I just vaguely mentioned the fact at home, Daddy said, "No, of course you won't," in a very final tone.
In fact, Margaret always had a taste for the company of older men, whatever her father Alf's protestations. But although much is made of her relationship with her father, far less is said or known about Mrs. Roberts.
Grandma was just a quiet, very supportive person in the background, really. Yeah, very much her husband's second fiddle rather than a noisy type.
Beatrice Roberts came into her husband's life through Methodism and was the daughter of a cloakroom attendant at Grantham Station. As seamstress, she was neat and tidy as a tailor's pattern. Margaret's letters to her sister suggest that Beatrice, far from being a non-figure in her life, a quiet absence, had a sort of censoring presence, a drain of the spirit.
I have decided that maroon would be the best colour for my wardrobe, as I'm having that pinky dress made up. I haven't told Mummy and Daddy about it, as I'm sure that Mummy, at any rate, would find it very extravagant.
Muriel candidly described her mother as a bigoted Methodist and admitted the two girls were not close to her. Indeed, a footnote in a letter from Margaret to Muriel shows how the distance between the girls and their mother was even of concern to Alf.
P.S. Daddy did wish you would find a nice fellow. As if anything happened to him, you wouldn't get on with Mummy and so wouldn't have a home unless married. He said this was his biggest worry at the moment.
Mrs. Thatcher didn't like talking about her mother, because I think it was hard for her to combine two things which she genuinely felt. One was respect and affection, and the other was this boredom, really, and a bit of guilt as well, because she never actually had an engagement with her mother and had sort of interesting conversations with her and sort of enjoyed her company. But her mother was actually, I think, a strong character and also had this aspect of domestic life which Margaret does like very much, which is this neatness, cleanness and skill, particularly because she was a seamstress. And it's one thing that Margaret would go back to again and again in conversation is her mother's skill as a seamstress.
Has Mummy started my blue slip and panties, do you know? If she's going to do the panties, I would like them in the style we did the parachute ones, cut on the cross from a small yoke.
My mother, something which is not necessarily known about her, she was extremely good with her hands, and it would be nothing for her to repair curtains or even make them herself if she had the time to do so. I certainly remember on a couple of occasions she turned her hand to that, and quite successfully. So from that perspective, there was an element of self-reliance, if you will. Thrift would be, I think, the word that comes to mind. And certainly I think that applied to everything that she did.
I seem to have a colossal amount of mending to do. All coat linings seem suddenly to have gone. And stockings, they are rapidly disappearing into thin air.
Self-reliance, hard work, drive. These were characteristics of the young Margaret. And aged just 16, she'd already formed a confident vision of her future.
Dear Muriel, Daddy does not like the idea of medical at all, but I'm taking biology, chemistry and maths main with French subsid. The next idea on the list is to go to university and take a science degree, then sit for a civil service exam for posts abroad. A degree is necessary for this for a woman.
I think this is a much more modern list. I think these were new in my time. I think those were the old ones. Those are the very old ones.
Margaret's drive and ambition and stamina for hard work brought her academic success. She appreciated her school and its role in her triumphs. And when she accepted a peerage, it was the name of the school that she took, Baroness Thatcher of Kesteven, not the name of her hometown, Grantham. Indeed, by the age of 18, Grantham was pretty much done for her. She'd won a place to study chemistry at Oxford University.
For more than 700 years, Oxford has flourished as a centre of learning and culture. Through calm and storm, triumph and disaster, it has grown in greatness and knowledge, making a continuous contribution to the civilization of the Western world.
My father, I think, was college or university material but couldn't go, and therefore he was desperately anxious that I should have every opportunity to go. And although he wasn't wealthy, I well remember when it came to the fact that I wanted to go to Oxford, and you had to have Latin to go to Oxford, and my school hadn't provided Latin in the curriculum. Nevertheless, he sacrificed enough to have me taught Latin by the local grammar school teacher, and I did it. But he was desperately anxious to give me every chance that he hadn't had, and I owe almost everything to this.
Women, too, have their place at Oxford, sharing equal opportunities with the men. They can prepare for careers in medicine, biology, law, and a dozen other spheres which not many years ago were closed to them.
I think she had very good memories of Oxford. It provided an exciting crucible for many of the aspects of her life which were particularly important. Rigorous intellectual examination as well as industrious learning, and exciting and profound debate on all elements of university life, including the political component.
Margaret took up a place at Somerville College and found it, just like Grantham, altered by the war.
The college buildings were, of course, all blacked out. There were baffle walls in front of the library and some of the other buildings. There were static water tanks in the gardens. There was one there in front of the chapel and one in the East Quadrangle. And the students themselves were expected to take part in various forms of war service in their spare time, hoeing for victory on the lawn. The favourite one in which Margaret Roberts engaged was entertaining American servicemen.
But from Margaret's point of view, although she went to Oxford with 2 Grantham friends, she admitted in her memoirs that she found the place cold and strangely forbidding. She says she went for walks alone around Christchurch Meadow and into Addison's Walk in Magdalen.
Dear Muriel, I washed and went into dinner at 7:15, expecting to see a number of people there, but found to my dismay that I was the only person that had yet arrived. So I had dinner in a solitary state, alone in that immense hall.
Oxford was a very different world to provincial Grantham, and one in which Margaret struggled to find her place. She was now one amongst many high-achieving young women, no longer at the top of the academic tree.
The Somerville Hall was a lovely hall, but it was set out with the high table, as always, at one end, and then the rest of the hall was 3 tables in a long row, and the top table tended to be the more exotic girls, reading perhaps PPE, and the bottom table, I'm afraid we thought were a bit of a snooty lot. It was Rodine and Cheltenham ladies and Down House in the bottom lot. And Margaret, of course, came from an ordinary grammar school. I don't think she'd have lasted for a minute, actually, in either the first table at the top for talk, which was, or the bottom, who were the real people with the real accents.
I can remember her saying to me once in Oxford days, in her new, refined sort of voice, "Margaret, don't you wish when you're asked where you went to school, and you wish, don't you, that you could say Cheltenham Ladies' College instead of Kesteven and Grantham Girls' School?"
It was difficult with Margaret because she was always a rather aloof person. She didn't easily unbend. I think there was always a degree of difficulty about her communications with the rest of us. One got that impression with Margaret that she wasn't a kind of real person.
I don't think she was very good at making friends, girlfriends, ever. Right through her life, not many.
If Somerville failed to provide Margaret with friendships, perhaps it was in part because it was considered an overwhelmingly left-wing college. Hardly a marriage made in heaven. But just along the road was the antidote, the Taylorian Institute, meeting place of the university's Conservative Association. The association would gather there and often dine opposite in the rather grand Randolph Hotel. Smart places, both of them, and a long way from Grantham. Margaret signed up enthusiastically, and the Oxford University Conservative Association, or AUCA, became her home.
Dear Muriel, as regards Conservative activities this term, I gave my paper on agricultural policy, which was a staggering success. Also, I went to a number of Conservative study groups, as well as the regular meetings on Friday nights and committee meetings, etc.
We were joined by this delightful, very active girl who knew exactly what she was doing, and she's very focused, and she knew her politics inside out, whereas we were rather thrashing around. Edward Ball, of course, was tuned into politics already, but the rest of us were complete beginners and learning as we went along. But Margaret really knew what she was doing and was totally focused.
Oxford brought Margaret face to face with the country's aristocracy, many of whom shared her conservatism. She got on easily with them, so much so that when the Duke of Buccleuch became aware that Margaret had financial difficulties, he organised a whip round and bought her a bicycle.
Well, she's very active and actually distributing our leaflets. She'd go off on her bicycle with our basket and go to the sort of places you wouldn't dare go to nowadays. You wouldn't let your daughter disappear into the dark alleyways of factories and other places. Anyhow, she went off, but brave as could be.
But more than just the chance to hobnob with the odd duke, the University Conservative Association opened up a whole social life for Margaret.
The Conservative dinner was on the 24th of February. The committee guests and speakers had a sherry party in the Randolph beforehand, and then we went into dinner at 7 o'clock.
We had meetings, we had government ministers who came, and we had the normal pattern of dinner, which the chairman, the president, would be host, with a visiting cabinet minister or whoever on their right, and the committee ranged round, all paid for, enjoying nice even wartime. I thought it was a perfectly good dinner.
For Margaret, these events were a chance to dress up, to make the most of her wardrobe, to look her best, to enjoy the bling.
Dear Muriel, SOS, could I borrow your pearls for the first of 3 meetings when I shall be wearing black? My black two-piece for the first and third, and your black dinner frock for the second, if you would send it. But the most important thing is the pearls, which have to be sent off straight away if they are to reach me by Friday.
I wear them not only because pearls have been the thing for Englishwomen for years, but they have a sort of luminescence about them, and particularly pearl earrings, and they do just give your face a little lift.
Margaret retained a fastidiousness about her appearance throughout her life, and an almost forensic ability to recall what she'd worn on any particular occasion.
I stand before you tonight in my red star chiffon evening gown.
Lady Thatcher always loved clothes, and she loved good fabrics. Her mother was a dressmaker, so she saw a lot of very nice clothes coming in and out of the house in Grantham. And the mother made a lot of the girls' clothes. She had a sister, Murial, and she knew about hemming and seaming and all sorts of things.
And the thing we've learned is never really press your hem. You know, sometimes you see people ironing a dress and they press along the hem until it looks like a knife edge. And then if you want to let it down, you can't. Just leave the hem gently rolled. And then you'll never press along the edge.
When she visited one of our nuclear submarines in Faslane, I recall that a message was delivered that please would she be sure and wear trousers, which created no small problem, because I don't think my mother ever owned a pair of trousers up to that point in her life.
It's not my job to be a fashion leader, but it is my job not to be obviously out of fashion or obviously wrongly dressed, and I must never be mutton dressed as lamb.
Never.
At Oxford, Margaret constantly worried about her weight and her appearance, the concerns of any young woman.
Dear Muriel, can you recommend any exercises or anything from the medical point of view, particularly for reduction of the area of the seat and control of the tummy muscles? Oh, and also reductions and uplift of the bust.
It was important for Margaret to look good, as she was now, for the first time in her life, moving in a world of men. And in the spring of her second year, her fellow students got a sense that something new had come into her life.
Well, it just became known that Margaret had got a boyfriend called Lord Tony. And we used to sort of tease her a bit about Lord Tony. And she would blush from bottom to top and just not really cope with it.
Dear Muriel, Tony had a spray of 8 orchids sent for me from London. So with the front part of my hair piled up on top, Jean and Mary said I looked simply smashing.
Margaret had come with a carnation given to her by a chap, and none of us can remember who it was. Needless to say, everybody wants to know who that chap was. I can't remember.
That chap was Tony Bray, and he wasn't a lord. He was an army cadet who'd arrived at Brasenose College in Oxford a year after Margaret on a 6-month joint services course. In the autumn of 2007, Tony Bray was living as a widower in a small house in Sussex.
That's more one I would recognise. Oh, that I would totally recognise. That's a nice one of her. That is a typical Margaret expression, which she wore more or less continuously. That was the face that she put on everything. I think she regarded me as somebody who was just simplistically not just a schoolboy, if you follow what I mean. There were a lot of exciting schoolboys who were, I'm sure, more handsome than I was, taller, whatever, more flamboyant or whatever you like. But she wouldn't go with her character, I don't think. So I think this would be what would have attracted her. And we saw a lot of each other. I mean, we would see each other on our spare times. And for the most part, just sort of talking about current affairs, what was going on, you know, politics up to a point, but particularly really the war and the situation of the war, and our own hopes afterwards. I think we were both interested in being with each other. I think she was quite fond of me.
Tony hired a car and we drove out to Abingdon to the country inn Crown and Thistle. I managed to borrow a glorious royal blue velvet cloak which matched the blue frock perfectly.
She looked absolutely terrific. She was wearing a large blue coat. I believe the dress underneath it was also blue, as far as I recall.
I felt absolutely on top of the world as we walked through the lounge at the Crown and Thistle, and everyone looked up and stared. We went into the bar and had a gin and grapefruit, and then to the dining room for dinner. We had some lovely thick creamy soup, followed by pigeon and then a chocolate sweet. With that we had moussec to drink. Moussec, in case you don't know, is a sparkling champagne.
If I can be immodest and say we were both good dancers, and so we thoroughly enjoyed dancing with each other. And I think we've probably monopolised each other's evening very firmly and very successfully, and she didn't seem to mind that at all.
We then drove back to the Randolph and got there at about 9:15. Things were in full swing by this time. The ballroom was marvellously decorated, and all the lighting was done with huge coloured lamps operating from the balcony. There were 2 other Conservative couples there whom we knew rather well, so we teamed up and had a thoroughly gay evening.
It sounds extraordinary in this day and age, but for the most part we just sat in our rooms and talked. We would have what I would describe as a sort of a modest amount of amorosity, for lack of a better word. I think she was slightly self-conscious about her size, and because she wasn't a small person, I mean, she was a well-built, buxom person. I think she regarded herself rightly as not having a fantastic body as such. But nevertheless, she could outthink every airhead there ever was around, really, without even raising her temperature in her brain at all, I should say. She invited me to spend a weekend with her family up in Grantham. I remember it was a little corner shop that she had there, and I remember a lot of steep staircases, and was given a lovely room and all the rest of it, and looked after quite well royally by her mother and her father. I mean, I enjoyed doing that, but I didn't allow it to weigh too heavily on my mind, if you understand me.
Soon after the Grantham visit, Tony's Oxford days were over. He left for army training in Dorset. The couple corresponded for a while. Tony sent Margaret this inscribed photograph of himself in military uniform. But then the letters stopped.
I didn't feel beholden to write lots of letters. I think I wrote 1 or 2 letters to her. She, I think, was quite interested in me because she wrote my parents, I know, and was sort of wondering what the score was. I think it just sort of faded away. I think I found other young ladies who were very interesting after the war, and so we left it that way.
As Tony faded away and the war ended, Margaret was left alone at Oxford. She busied herself with politics, becoming president of the university's Conservative Association. Her letters didn't dwell on the Tony affair at all, but it was undoubtedly important to her.
She took the relationship seriously, as being a serious-minded young woman she would. You can't imagine her just mucking around. That would never have occurred to her. And the relationship had a physical aspect. They kissed one another and cuddled one another, and by Tony Bray's account, she was very keen on that, though he thought not experienced. He thought, I think rightly, that he was the first man. They didn't sleep together, but all this was a sign of her seriousness. She wouldn't have just been playing. And I think it had an effect on him which she didn't desire, because it put him off to some extent. Because I think he realised, first of all, that she was more serious than he wanted. Secondly, that her parents were lower class than he. And thirdly, that the whole thing was just a bit too much, really.
At this historic ceremony, the public orator proclaims the achievements of those whom Oxford is honouring.
Margaret graduated from Oxford in 1947 with a second-class degree in chemistry. She was now part of the country's graduate elite.
Oxford did give her the springboard that she required, and it gave concrete form to the ambitions which were always there in her character. And it taught her a lot about politics, and she met famous people who were already adult politicians who came to speak at the university. And she became a more sophisticated person.
After the majestic spires of Oxford came the smoking stacks of industry. Margaret embarked on a round of job interviews at various chemical firms.
The person I disliked most was the personnel manager. He was a slimy creature, not at all suitable for his job.
One ICI manager complained that Margaret was too strong a personality to work here. But then neither was she taken by all that they had to offer.
Billingham is nothing else but ICI. One would meet nothing else but the people you worked with. No one of the kind I've been used to in Oxford.
Eventually, after 3 or 4 interviews, in the late summer of 1947, Margaret took a post as a research chemist at BX Plastics in Manningtree in Essex on the River Stour. She took the job because she thought the post had a managerial element to it and would allow her insight into the running of a company. But it was not to be, and she records in her memoirs somewhat despondently,
I found myself donning my white coat again and immersing myself in the wonderful world of plastics.
The whole thing failed to inspire her greatly after the thrills and high life of Oxford, the elated letters to Muriel about balls and dances with Tony Bray gave way to more mundane matters, with a familiar dash of impatience.
The wear and tear on clothes of all kinds is terrific in industry. By the way, have my shoes come back from Uddles yet? I've asked that in every blessed letter I've written, but not a word about them have I received in any reply.
In truth, the idea of working as a chemist never excited Margaret. She took the Manningtree job because it allowed her to be close to London, the heart of politics, and where she hoped, one day, she might be able to study for the bar. Meanwhile, although Margaret had been bruised by her first boyfriend adventure in Oxford, finding a man remained high on the agenda. A fellow lodger, Teddy West, occasionally took her to the cinema.
On Saturday evening, Teddy West and I went to the flicks. By the way, can you scrounge a packet of cigarettes to bring up for him? He buys me so many odd drinks that I like to toss him an odd 26 now and then.
But Teddy wasn't destined to be Mr. Right.
If I do go out with Mr. West, we only go for a drink or something that doesn't demand any dressing up. And he doesn't dance.
Teddy soon disappeared from the correspondence, only to be replaced by Brian Harrison, a leading member of the local Young Conservatives. A former Cambridge student, tall and sporty, Harrison was like a ghost of Margaret's Oxford days.
She was very good looking, and consequently one did remember her. Quite often we were dancers, and she always took part in those activities. She danced, my memory was, she danced very well.
He is really an Australian, but he was left a small estate of 1,500 acres in the country about 5 miles from Colchester, and has now come to live here permanently to look after it. He's about 26 and very nice. The brief encounter was very pleasant, and he has my address for when he comes back from the Xmas vacation.
Well, I found her very likeable, yes. But, I was never at the stage that Dennis got to.
Margaret arranged her Essex life just as she had in Oxford, the day job in the lab followed by the world of local Conservatives, offering her a social life and feeding the real passion, politics.
We used just to go and take a soapbox, I suppose it was, and stand there and just try and draw as much attention as we could to ourselves. And it worked. She used her knowledge and she dealt with any hecklers extremely well.
Dear Muriel, I still don't like the work very much, but the politics and social life are beginning to go with a swing, which compensates a lot. I enjoyed the Brains Trust last Wednesday, and we all went and had a drink at the George afterwards to round off the proceedings. The socialists were all of the intellectual type, and quite nice.
Margaret had successfully moved her politics from the cloisters of Oxford to the streets of Essex. But as ever, she preferred to write to Muriel not about policy or ideology, but about her appearance and a lack of money.
I decided to buy a really nice undie set to go under my turquoise chiffon blouse. It is a very pale turquoise colour and cost £5 5 shillings. I'll not have to spend anything else for the rest of the month.
If money was to be spent, it was to be on familiar pleasures. Margaret wrote an ecstatic letter about a weekend that she'd just spent back in Oxford, a round of sherry parties and dinner parties, a delicious taste of what she feared she may have left behind. And it ended with another blast from the past.
A letter from Tony Bray. The letter was very weird and sentimental. For 3 years I have not been able to write to you due to circumstances beyond my control. And so on in that strain. I shall write back and tell him to let sleeping dogs lie.
Despite her protestations about sleeping dogs, Margaret couldn't resist renewing the friendship with the recently demobbed Tony. She reasoned that any reunion would be
more to let him see how I've changed than to see him.
She came to see me certainly once or twice when I was in Brasenose. She had tea, I remember, in my rooms in Brasenose, certainly on one, maybe more occasion.
Margaret gave an enthusiastic report to Muriel of her Oxford reunion with Tony. It had been more than a quick cup of tea. They dined at the Randolph and Tony took her to the theatre. The weather was glorious and they punted on the river. She says she found it easy to get on with him, although she refused to be drawn on the former relationship.
The only direct reference I had of times past was when he said quite steadily, "You only realise what you had when you've lost it, and you know what I'm referring to." However, I ignored the remark, and conversation rapidly picked up and flowed on.
There's a sense that the slighted Margaret now wants the upper hand, and that her way of gaining control is to show no vulnerability, make an impression, but above all hold the reins.
No mention was made of any future arrangements, for which I was truly thankful, for it just wouldn't have been on for me. Although I quite enjoyed seeing him again for a short time, it satisfied my curiosity. But he's a weird-looking chap to cart around the place. By the way, he didn't know I'd been president of ALCA. He was immensely impressed.
But in September 1948, Margaret met Tony again, this time for a date in London.
I was wearing my blue frock and little blue hat, little fur jacket with all wine accessories. And I forgot to mention, he presented me with a spray of pink roses.
The London meeting was described effusively to Muriel. Tea at Fuller's in Regent Street, a trip to see Carissima at the Palace.
During the interval, we went and had gin and vermouth in the bar. Tony had booked dinner for 9 o'clock at Kettner's, quite a fashionable West End restaurant. I really enjoyed the evening very much, though I wouldn't dream of re-striking up the association with Tony.
They did see each other again, but as before things petered out, until over 20 years later, this time at the House of Commons, where Margaret was now Shadow Environment spokesman, one final meeting took place. Tony, then a successful stockbroker, came to the House to meet Margaret to discuss his idea that council houses could be sold off to sitting tenants. The policy famously appealed to Margaret. But the old relationship was never even mentioned.
Oh, well, that shows her at her most redact, but also shows her face and her hair. That's the hair I remember. I think we had a degree of happiness together when we were with each other, but I think that apart, I wouldn't say that she was simplistically a happy person.
For Margaret, getting a man was a formula that she hadn't cracked. Around the time of the Tony relationship, she wrote to Muriel saying,
"I don't know that your male problem is the same as mine. You seem infinitely more successful with them than I do."
It's a rare expression of self-doubt. But if her personal life was complicated, her political life was about to take a dramatic turn for the better. In October 1948, with Margaret just 23 years old, she joined Oxford's graduate delegation to the Conservative Party conference in Llandudno.
I decided I couldn't possibly go to Llandudno with the communal coat as the only top coat I had, so I drew some savings certificates out and I bought a fine lightweight black wool swagger. It's of a rather distinctive design. I've drawn it rather stunted, but it's full length, of course.
Margaret found the quality of the speaking poor, possibly because she wasn't called on to speak herself. But a chance meeting with an old Oxford friend led to Margaret putting herself forward as a candidate for a seat in Kent. Dartford was an industrial stronghold, a safe Labour seat with an all but unassailable majority of 20,000. The young Conservatives referred to some of the town's housing estates rather dauntingly as Little Moscow.
This, of course, was where Margaret was such a gem when she first came to us, because she instilled into us this idea that if you had the courage of your conviction, you could do anything. She wasn't out of the ordinary, she was just exciting.
Margaret's charisma won her admirers not only in the local Conservative Party, but in her private life. Just 5 days before she was formally adopted as Dartford's candidate, a new man came into her life.
He's about 35 and has a kind of naivety that only a Scotsman can have. I expected to be bored to tears, but in fact he was really rather sweet, with quite a sense of humour.
Margaret was on the lookout for a man to accompany her into her political future, and the letter to Muriel is a bit like running through a CV.
His farm is worth £25,000. He has 3,000 shares of ICI, now standing at 47 shillings, 1,000 of something else, 500 of this and that, and so on and so forth.
These were worthy credentials, and Margaret enjoyed the attention of her new suitor.
He drove me home in his present rather old car, and got quite ardent on the way. I said I couldn't possibly fix another definite date, so he's going to phone me. The funniest part is that although I've been introduced to him twice, I can never catch his name and still don't know it.
The farmer's name was Willie Cullen, and he was to figure greatly in Margaret's life. History doesn't record whether he was amongst those listening to Margaret 5 days later at the meeting that put the seal on her selection as Dartford's new candidate. But in the audience was another man.
When the meeting was over, I went back and had drinks with the people I'd been dining with, a Mr. and Mrs. Soward. A co-director of his, a Major Thatcher, who has a flat in London, age about 36, plenty of money, was also dining with them, and he drove me back to town at about midnight.
Dennis Thatcher, a former officer mentioned in dispatches, had his own prosperous paint company. An ex-public schoolboy, he was socially a cut above Margaret. Popular mythology suggests that when he arrived on the scene, Margaret knew he was the man for her. But references to Dennis in her letters show that that was certainly not the case.
Not a frightfully attractive creature. Very reserved, but quite nice. He's not very fond of meeting people. He says he doesn't get on with them awfully well.
It's an inauspicious start for Dennis. The Scottish farmer seems to be in pole position. Margaret's comments about him being chalk from cheese in comparison to the choice of words used for Dennis.
He is awfully sweet. I'm getting quite fond of him, and a very welcome relaxation.
She liked Willie Cullen. She thought he was fun, and he was very keen on her, and she, of course, responded to that. And he had, though he was famously being close with his money, he was actually quite gallant with her.
But bizarrely, however fond Margaret declared herself to be, in the same letter she was explicitly saying that this relationship was not for her, and that her sister, Muriel, might like to step in.
You had better come down here some other weekend to meet the current boyfriend. By the way, he will never become your brother-in-law, though I have high hopes that he may be mine one day.
Whatever Margaret's intentions with Willie, he was ready to introduce her to his family at a dinner party at his home, Fulton Hall. But the evening sent shivers down Margaret's spine. It was a close-up view of a world she didn't wish to make her own.
The wives are typical wives. They know of domestic matters and nothing else. I stayed with the men after supper talking about many things, and when William suggested that maybe we ought to join the ladies, David, a farmer friend, said in a rather contemptuous fashion, "Why? They don't talk politics or anything else in there."
The world of Willie Cullen is a very much the world of the solid yeoman farmer. Absolutely no pretensions to the wider world, intellectual life, the world of books. This was too narrow for her. And I think in particular, it was too much the traditional woman's role. And what starts to germinate in Margaret's mind is that Willie Cullen's an excellent man, and why shouldn't he marry her sister, who is, by the standards of that time, getting on a bit, and who needs a man. And so all this is constructed by Margaret so that Muriel and Willie will meet and that it will all come to fruition.
But the handover from Margaret to Muriel was not immediate. Margaret continued to fan the flames of Willie's ardour, accompanying him to social events and enjoying gifts from him, ranging from expensive scents to vital commodities, butter, eggs, grapes, and one special one.
William has given me a very nice black calf handbag. We had my initials put on it as well, and it looks awfully nice. I quite loftily say it's not very expensive. It's about twice as much as you or I would pay. I'll have to hang on to William for a while longer now.
Margaret's new handbag became a frequent sight on the streets of Dartford as she threw herself into preparations for the 1950 general election. She told Muriel that she had no time now for what she called a private life. And refusing to be intimidated by his massive majority, she took on her opponent, the sitting Labour MP Norman Dodds. She described to Muriel the two candidates' first meeting on the dance floor of a civic ball.
We were dragged off into the middle of the ballroom, and quite a ceremony was made of the whole affair. Mr. Dodds said he was very sorry I was an opponent. He then publicly asked me for the next dance. The press took pictures and asked for reactions. I said we were in tune when we were dancing, and Mr. Dodds said, in perfect harmony. I imagine the report will make front-page news next week.
Away from the dance floor, Margaret's campaign was based on stirring patriotism, and she was impressive in public debate, thorough in her preparations.
I would come home from doing canvassing, and my family, who went to help as well, and we would go off to bed, and as our room was opposite where her house was that she was staying, I always remember my dear father, he used to go to the window and look, and he'd say, "There is that good girl burning the midnight oil."
Whilst Margaret was burning the midnight oil, the future of her liaison with Farmer Willie had been left hanging. It needed resolution. His introduction to Muriel finally took place, and Margaret now reassured her sister that the field was clear for her.
I shan't marry Bill, for though very fond of him, I am not in love with him, and a marriage between us would falter after 2 or 3 months.
I think they both realised they weren't for each other. She alerted my mother, if you like, to the fact that she'd met this Scottish farmer and that she might suit him more than her. And mother was quite happy to live a country housewife type of existence.
Margaret's instincts were right. Muriel and Willie hit it off. But despite the deal with Muriel, Margaret must have carried on seeing Willie, because when she writes enthusiastically to her sister about a new doctor that she's just met while visiting a Dartford hospital, Willie is clearly still on the scene, and apparently still in the hunt.
I told Willie I'd met a doctor who impressed me very much, and he wrote back and said, was I giving him a hint to get out?
In the same letter, Margaret also mentions Dennis. 3 horses now lined up for the same race: the farmer, the paintman, and the doctor. Margaret's quest for Mr. Right was becoming a bit of a soap opera. But in January 1950, one of the candidates was finally to be eliminated. The sisters' conspiracy was to be resolved.
I have written to William in the vein I told you. We are meeting in London on Saturday afternoon to talk over the various aspects of We Three, and it will then be broken off between he and I, for good and all. Hope you approve.
But before Margaret had even made it to the postbox, the phone rang. It was Willie. The couple talked, and Willie was finally and conclusively dumped. It merited a quick postscript to Muriel.
P.P.S. I told him from henceforth that I would, in law only, be taking a sisterly interest in future. He seemed quite satisfied and is quite pleased at future prospects.
That was that. And astonishingly, only 6 weeks later, Willie and Muriel were engaged to be married. Margaret immediately began designing her own dress for the big day and handed out advice.
Don't worry about the pre-wedding jitters. Fee Miller says everyone has them. I think you should have a headdress with a little blue shoulder-length veil, as otherwise folks won't know bride from bridesmaid. I'll just have a little draped cap.
The engagement was announced in the Telegraph, and Margaret rejoiced.
It gives the stamp of certainty to the whole affair.
Auntie Margaret, She was very fond of my father, and he of her, certainly, right to the very end. I would have said they were more like friends than they were like relations, if that doesn't sound silly. It was a better relationship than one might have with one's sister-in-law.
Margaret fought her first general election as a Conservative candidate on February the 23rd, 1950. She was the youngest woman candidate in any party, and she was roundly applauded, in defeat. But she'd wiped 6,000 off the Labour majority, a result that was deemed a triumph, and she agreed to stand again. The slim Labour government majority had made another general election both inevitable and imminent. But of course another incentive to have a second crack at Dartford may have been her latest attraction, the Dartford doctor.
We went for a drive round some of the Weald of Kent. It wasn't a very nice afternoon, but still we had a very pleasant drive. I think we are both getting very fond of one another. In fact, more than that. I hope so.
The doctor's name was Robert Henderson, and he was 47 years old, 23 years Margaret's senior. A commander of the British Empire and inventor of the British version of the iron lung, despite his age, he was still a bachelor.
Robert Henderson is the only one of the four men who she always describes in favourable terms. She never ever says anything critical about him, except sort of teases about how she's worried because he's going off on a cruise and there's going to be a lot of rich women there. But there's nothing in any way disparaging or mocking, which to some extent there is about the others. I think she really respected him and loved him and thought this was a man I can really admire. And this is always a very important emotion with her and men, is not just liking them and enjoying their company or desiring them, but actually admiring them for their achievements. And she tends to like older men, and indeed men rather like her father, actually.
But Margaret's attraction to the doctor was always edged with anxiety. Her letters to Muriel clearly indicate her fear that the doctor might either plump for someone else or find some other reason for not pursuing the relationship.
He apparently spent part of Christmas with a big farming family who own half of the farms in Essex. They are enormously wealthy and have 5 daughters of marriageable age, one of which is a doctor. The prospects don't look very hopeful, do they?
In May 1951, Margaret took a flat in London. This was a key decision in her life. It allowed her finally to enroll for the bar and pursue her legal ambition.
My goodness, there's a lot of work to be done, and it will come terribly expensive.
Expense was an issue, for the rented flat had to be transformed into a home suitable for Margaret's intentions. For the first time, now aged 25, she would be living alone and be able to entertain.
Flat progressing slowly. All curtains are up, but lounge ones will have to come down. The builders have been in, and I can now get on with the kitchen. I have undercoated the walls, and I'm going round tonight to put on the woodwork will have to be painted, cupboard doors, etc.
But no amount of work was ever too much for Margaret. The DIY was crammed in around constituency duties.
I'm canvassing twice a week, which is taking up quite a bit of time. It doesn't look as though things will ever slack off.
With the flat secured, Dennis Thatcher was an occasional caller. But he clearly still wasn't making the impact of a future husband.
I can't say I ever really enjoy going out for the evening with him. He has not got a very prepossessing personality.
In the same letter, Margaret reserved her compliments for the Dartford doctor, Robert Henderson.
Tonight, Robert is coming up, and we are going out for dinner. Last time he came, I cooked a slap-up dinner. 4 courses, just to show him.
But despite all Margaret's hospitality, her worst fears about the doctor came true. Just 3 months after the move to London, the relationship was broken off and the doctor disappeared altogether from Margaret's correspondence. According to her father Alf, Margaret was very upset.
I don't think it's completely possible to tell from the evidence exactly what brought the relationship to an end. But I think I can say pretty confidently that he did not terminally reject her, because if he had, she would not have spoken to him again. Her pride would have been hurt and she would not have wanted to go near him.
In fact, Margaret did keep in touch with the doctor, but it was a practical matter that led her back to him. Only 2 years later, she told her sister that she'd written to him about a medical issue that was on her mind, her son Mark's circumcision.
I don't like the idea of having it done on the health service in London, as you don't know who's going to do it, but it costs £15 to £20 to have it done privately. I am writing to Robert to ask him who does it at the Victoria Hospital under the health service, because I know Mark will be wonderfully looked after there.
With the doctor out of the running, Margaret chose to move swiftly on. No looking back, no regrets. And very quickly there came news. All the negative comments about Dennis that had studied her correspondence were suddenly swept aside. Margaret and Dennis Thatcher were to be married.
Mrs. Thatcher, though she is in many ways a romantic person, is also a practical person, and she's got to get married. It's part of her whole life plan and expectation. But in her particular case, it's also this need for it to fit with wider ambitions. So it's very important to marry someone ideally older and better off and settled in life. And suddenly there it is. Though undoubtedly genuinely fond of him, I think her decision is not really a romantic one. This is the right man and the right time. And suddenly she sees it all coming into place.
Despite the fact that Dennis was a divorcee, Margaret's preacher father Alf was ready to welcome him as a son-in-law.
He is an exceedingly nice fellow. Also, of course, very comfortably situated financially. He owns a 1948 Jaguar and also a Triumph, but is wanting to get a Jaguar Mark V.
History records Dennis as the rock in Margaret's life. He acted as consort, faithfully strapped into the passenger seat. He was robustly right-wing and right from the start was there to shore up her beliefs and aspirations and performances.
They're going to see if Dennis does his share of the washing up.
The election campaign immediately got off the mark. The bill posters began to cover the hoardings with slogans, while committee rooms, staffed by eager volunteers, hummed with activity.
The 1951 general election was fixed for the 25th of October. It was time for Dennis to make his first tentative steps into public life. He came out to bat for his new fiancée, turning up to support her in his Jag, and allegedly having to be restrained from tackling hecklers. But for the moment, the couple's engagement was kept secret. As a divorcee, Dennis could lose Margaret votes.
This reporter came in one morning, very scruffy looking, with a big bag, and dumped it on the desk and sort of said, I'm here from the Daily Mirror, and we hear that Margaret Roberts has got engaged to Dennis Thatcher. Well, we didn't know anything about this anyway, so we sort of said no, and I called somebody more official, and we bundled him out of the door, and that was the first we heard ourselves.
On the 25th of October 1951, the Conservative Party won the general election.
Winston Spencer Churchill.
And Winston Churchill returned to number 10. But Dartford remained loyal to Labour, and although Margaret had further reduced the majority in her impossible seat, she lost. This was the end of Dartford for Margaret, but no matter. Now she had other things on her mind. On the 13th of December 1951, she married Dennis in London at the Wesleyan Chapel on City Road. She wore a velvet dress of sapphire blue and a hat modelled on a Gainsborough portrait of the Duchess of Devonshire. Long ostrich feathers cascaded down her face. Finding the right man could finally come off the to-do list.
All of a sudden it dawned on me that this was the biggest thing in one's life, now kind of sorted out. And therefore one turned one's mind both to other things. Is that a strange thing to say? That I was, 25, 26 when we were married. That it was. I mean, one recognised that to choose a partner for life is really the biggest thing in life.
Dennis proved to be a good choice for Margaret. Their marriage was happy and sustaining. Her instincts had been right, and she never regretted, publicly at least, her choice of the outsider in the marriage stakes.
I suspect, actually, that she was in love with Tony Bray, but this is so early on in her life that this is really the first experience of love and just the excitement of being in love. And so it would have seemed dramatic to her, but in some sense it wasn't serious, or it was the practice for later. With Willie Cullen, I think there was real affection, enjoyment, and some attraction, but not deep love. I think with Robert Henderson there was a strong feeling of admiration which goes so far that it comes into romantic love. And I think she was sort of touched by him. And Dennis, in that sense, didn't mean that she wasn't serious about marrying Dennis. It wasn't a cynical decision, but it was on the rebound.
The newlyweds spent their wedding night in luxurious surroundings that Margaret wholeheartedly approved of.
The Savoy is a wonderful hotel in London. You just press a bell and a valet or maid or waiter appears.
Then it was off on honeymoon to the island of Madeira, where just 20 minutes after arriving, Margaret wrote to her sister with her impressions.
Some things that the natives think wonderful are very second-rate to us. Some of the people with us are very nice, but some are rather tatty tourists, Jews and nouveau riche.
Back in London, Mr. and Mrs. Thatcher moved into Dennis's Chelsea bachelor pad. Unsurprisingly, Margaret enjoyed making her new home and the social opportunities that came with marriage.
We are giving our first cocktail party a week on Monday, when we have invited 50 people to come. 8 of them are MPs, so we may have a number of last-minute refusals for unavoidable reasons.
Margaret started her law course in London and continued to attend political conferences around the country. In fact, she became so busy that less than 4 months into married life, her father Alf wrote to Muriel saying,
"We had a letter from Margaret on Saturday morning, obviously scrawled in great haste, but it appears that, if anything, she's busier now than before marriage with one thing or the other."
But there was always room for more in Margaret's life. And in June 1952, she contacted Conservative Central Office, wanting to have another shot at becoming an MP.
After the 51 election, she didn't quite know what to do. She tried 1 or 2 marginal seats, and they turned her down. The cry in those days, we want more women candidates, we want more women MPs. But it always turned out when you went to a selection committee, they'd say, well, this is an industrial, or this is an agricultural seat, and women are not quite right.
But before Margaret could find a constituency that was ready for her female talents, her plans were scuppered by pregnancy. On the 15th of August 1953, Margaret gave birth to twins Mark and Carol. It was a turning point in her life.
And I remember looking at these two and thinking, now, this is fantastic. Now, if I'm not careful, I'm never going to make an effort to get back to a sort of intellectual pursuits. I'm just going to be so overcome with this that I'm not going to continue with the law or politics or anything. And I really ought to be able to do both.
England was certainly making a good start, but with his score at 37, May was...
Dennis knew nothing of the birth of his children until he got home from a day's watching England take on Australia in a test match at the Oval.
And the first day's cricket ended.
And before Margaret had even left the maternity ward, she'd arranged to go ahead and take her bar finals. She passed them when the twins were just 5 months old, and she was still only 28. She was now juggling 2 worlds to the best of her abilities.
Dear Muriel, thank you very much for the vests and romper suits. We have always operated on the minimum number of vests, 7 especially as they have both had a tummy bug in the last 2 days and have had to be changed frequently because of vomiting. I slept in the nursery and took over night duty, as I should have been alert all night anyway and probably have woken Dennis, so it seemed to me more sensible to let Nanny have a decent night's sleep and for me to do duty.
I mean, the earliest memories I have of my mother were her coming home in the late afternoon and then just getting on with whatever had to be done in the house. And that generally will have evolved, beginning to cook dinner or something like that. Yes, certainly she was committed to, when Mother was there, she was fully engaged in all elements of running the home.
She was quite determined always not to be chained to the house. And she felt bad about it, and she knew, though she wouldn't quite put it this way, that there were consequences, that it was less happy for the children than it would otherwise have been. And she would, in old age, say that sometimes that she'd got that wrong.
Margaret chose to specialise in tax law, a pragmatic decision as it allowed a lifestyle that could fit in with motherhood.
The days simply fly past. I go up to Lincoln's Inn most days for lectures and study. At the present moment, I'm trying to clear up a backlog of letters and reckon I have 50 or more to write to do this. Twixt and tween us, we haven't a single free evening this week.
With the work came plenty of social opportunities. She and Dennis enjoyed cocktail parties, buffet suppers, conservative balls, and of course dancing. This time at the Colony Club in Berkeley Square. But it was around this time, with Margaret and Dennis moving in a very different world from Muriel's, that the two sisters' correspondence became less frequent.
I think the relationship between the sisters definitely weakened, largely because of circumstances, because Margaret's so busy and they're not physically very close. But there is also another reason, which is some social distance. They didn't greatly like Dennis, and I think the reason the Cullens didn't greatly like Dennis is that they thought that he looked down on them and that they weren't grand enough for him. And when he turned up, he would say things like, "How are things down on the farm?" making them feel small.
Uncle Dennis, yeah, he was a little bit different to us. Mother sometimes felt Uncle Dennis was a bit pompous and came from a very privileged background and looked down his nose at us as mere farmers. But other than that, they were very good friends, all four of them, Mother, Father and Uncle Dennis and Margaret.
Whatever was happening within the sisters' relationship, nothing could ultimately extinguish Margaret's passion for politics, nor her ambition. In 1955, she'd announced that she would be putting politics aside for 10 years to concentrate on the family and the law. But like an addict falling out of rehab, she was back within just 13 months.
She tried quite a lot of places, everywhere, but somehow she didn't gel with some of the divisions, that's all she went to look at. In the end, she got Finchley, and even then she told me after, there were one or two people in the association who were not very happy about having a woman, but she soon, once they knew her, she got over that one very quickly.
Dear Muriel, once again I have been shortlisted for a safe constituency. This time it is Finchley, which has a Conservative majority of 12,000. I expect the usual prejudice against women will prevail, and that I shall probably come the inevitable close second.
She came on, neatly dressed, and everyone sort of went quiet, she was just electric. She had that charisma. I can still see it to this day. She spoke so quickly and about lots of matters. You couldn't possibly digest it all, but there she was standing there, and obviously she would make a wonderful choice in my eyes. I was amazed how good she was.
Margaret's main rival for the Finchley seat, a one-legged brigadier with a military cross, proved no match for her. On July the 14th, 1958, she was selected candidate for Finchley. Dennis was away, not watching cricket this time, but abroad on business. He says he learned the news in a discarded copy of the Evening Standard that he read, while slightly the worse for drink, on a flight home. The Evening Standard headline was, "Tories choose beauty."
We were very lucky in Finchley, I think, very privileged to have had her. And thank God we chose her, because they might not have done. They could have chosen one of the other three gentlemen, but they didn't. They chose Margaret.
Trafalgar Square was the chief rallying point for Londoners who aimed to make election night a real night out, and to see the results chalked up.
The general election on the 8th of October 1959 resulted in victory for the Conservative Party. In Finchley, Margaret basked in a massive majority of over 16,000.
I think the earliest memory I have of my mother, funnily enough, was the day after she was elected as a Member of Parliament, when I, for some reason, walked into the garage in our house in Kent, and my father's car was just covered in stickers and with photos of my mother. And I knew something was going on. And that's an abiding memory that I have.
Back home in Grantham, Margaret's father was proud as punch, but realised that his daughter would now be busier than ever before. Just 10 days after Margaret entered the House of Commons, he wrote to Muriel a letter that is a premonition of how Margaret's new life will take her still further away from him.
We're all getting settled down after the election excitement. We, so far, have only received a short letter from Margaret, but she says she's completely inundated with correspondence. We realise that, so exercise patience. I hope she will soon be writing to you.
Throughout her life, Margaret celebrated her father, but in truth, as she grew older, she found him an unwelcome distraction. This is how she described him when he came to stay with her and Dennis soon after her mother had died.
Dear Muriel, read Pop. He is eating the most enormous meals and doing absolutely nothing except reading. I shall have to shunt Pop off on Saturday the 14th of January at the outside. Will this be all right with you? Otherwise he will just hang on and not take any hints.
Just a couple of months before Alf Roberts died in 1970, he wrote to Muriel saying,
I'm sorry to say I never hear anything from Margaret, either by letter or phone. In fact, I don't think I know their new phone number.
And just 10 days later, in one of his last surviving letters, he writes,
I still have not heard from Margaret.
8 months after her father Alf's death, Margaret returned to Grantham for his memorial service and the dedication of a lectern. Now Secretary of State for Education, she turned to her sister and complained that she hadn't been seated in a position befitting of a cabinet minister. Muriel replied, "This service isn't for you."
Mrs. Thatcher fled from her background in Grantham in many ways in order to become a famous and successful woman. But she returned to it rhetorically. And funnily enough, this was genuine. Though she had no desire to go back to Grantham and was very glad not to be there, she was always faithful to what she'd learnt at her father's knee. And she did, therefore, project the experiences of her childhood and the beliefs of her father on a global scale. And that gave her, in some people's view, limitations, but in another way, a unique strength. And I think people responded to that tremendous underlying genuineness and simplicity which came from those roots.
His death. Now she's just coming into Downing Street now. Here comes the Prime Ministerial rover, bearing now Mrs. Thatcher as Prime Minister.
It took just under 20 years for Margaret to make the journey from Finchley to number 10. The great self-improver had pulled off the greatest self-improvement imaginable, from provincial obscurity to global fame.
Well, of course, I just owe almost everything to my own father. I really do. And it's passionately interesting to me that the things which I learned in a small town, in a very modest home, are just the things which I believe have won the election.
Dear Muriel, Daddy does not like the idea of medical at all. But I'm taking biology, chemistry and maths. The next idea on the list is to go to university and take a science degree, then sit for a civil service exam. I must stop now, as it is time to go to Sunday school. Lots of love, Margaret.
The sisters continued to see each other at number 10, on the farm in Essex, and at Margaret's latest address, Chequers, where Muriel and the family were invited. But although number 10 was the ultimate letterhead, there would be no time for frivolous letter writing now. Now was the time for the affairs of state.